Welcome back to the Pacific Northwest Ethnobotany class. I'm your host Abe, and this week's module is going to focus on diverse habitats. And one of the best places to look at habitat diversity is close to the ocean, because the ocean is just very different from the land. And the ocean also provides us with a whole bunch of different types of shorelines as well as upland environments. So great place to explore the diversity. We have gravel beaches, we have sandy beaches, we have rocky beaches. We'll be looking at some of the life along those, as well as different shoreline types like rocky headlands and salt marshes. And so we'll be exploring those different habitats and the plants of ethnobotanical significance here in Bowman Bay at Deception Pass State Park. I'm in what's called the intertidal zone here, and it's defined by the area between the lowest low tide and the highest high tide. And it is really sculpted by some abiotic factors, one being flooding by water, another being salt stress, and another being wave action that disturbs things. And you'll notice that all the rocks on this beach are fairly rounded, and that's because they've rolled. And that makes it a difficult environment for plants. A plant that likes to grow and attach to the ground, or potentially could attach to a rock, is going to get, through the rolling action, is just going to get churned off of that rock or rubbed off of that rock. Not to mention the fact that very few plants can survive in salt water. But there are some plants that, one plant we'll see later that does manage to grow in the salty environment, but not on an intensely battered beach like this, where the waves are constantly disturbing the ground. So if we're looking for plants on a shoreline, we're going to have to go up a little higher above the highest of the high tide lines. And we can see here that the highest tides push the driftwood up along the edge of the beach. And then above the driftwood is usually where we start to see some flowering plants, some plants that might be potentially useful. So we see things like dune grass, this nice tall grass here, growing above what's called the littoral zone on a beach. And then just on the other side, in what's called the back shore, we have some really great plants. So let's go take a look. A lot of them are kind of small, so we'll get down real close. So this is a plant called beach strawberry, aptly named. Loves growing along the beaches, needs a lot of sunlight to flourish. And because occasionally salt spray comes up and lands on the beach here, woody plants hate salt even more than some of our herbaceous plants. And so that salt spray keeps the trees at bay and keeps this plant from getting shaded out by taller trees. Beach strawberry is distinctive in that it has, of our three different strawberry species, it has the biggest flowers. Some of these flowers are just massive. And it has leaves that are really shiny. And they don't have really distinct veins. We'll see probably later one called woodland strawberry that has very distinct veins. So anyway, this beach strawberry is very edible and delicious, and in fact our cultivated strawberries are a hybrid between the beach strawberry and the woodland strawberry. So two species found here in western Washington are hybridized to produce the berries that you buy in the grocery store. In addition to eating the berries, you can make a delightful tea by steeping the leaves in warm water, and it's a mildly sweet strawberry flavored tea, so try that sometime. Another great reason to come to shorelines for this unit is that our emphasis is going to be more on herbaceous plants. And because shorelines get a lot of, well, they're challenging environments for trees, winds blow trees down, salt spray kills trees, and sunlight has a better chance of coming in at an angle over the water into the side of a forest, and so it's just a better environment for non-woody plants or herbaceous plants. And the next one I want to talk about is cow parsnip. Now cow parsnip doesn't sound all that great, but it's a really important plant. Song sparrow calling. All sorts of birds calling. Okay, anyway, cow parsnip is easy to identify by this umbel-shaped flower. Now, all members of the carrot family have an umbel-shaped flower, but this is probably the largest, and usually it has a flat-topped umbel. And it has a very hairy stem, and actually on a sunny day like today, you need to be careful because the juices from the stem, they react with the sunlight and can actually give you a burn on your skin that looks like a really bad sunburn or a chemical burn. It is a chemical burn. So be careful harvesting this plant on a sunny day, but anyway, it is really valued as a root vegetable, shoot vegetable by indigenous peoples up and down the coast. And I'm going to find one that's in the perfect state for harvesting and show you how it's done. But when they're flowering, it's too late, so we have to find one that hasn't yet flowered. This flower is just about to start emerging, and I think we can find one that's even a little bit younger. But some good features for the cow parsnip, this hairy stem. There are other members of the carrot family that are deadly poisonous. One is called poison hemlock, and water hemlock is another. And they have stems that are hairless. So be sure that if you are going to try and eat cow parsnip, that it has really big leaves like this, and it has a hairy stem. And you should probably identify it several times before you try eating it. Alright, so to eat this, what you need to do is cut the stem off. You want to make sure it's a flowering stem. And then you just peel off the hairy skin, and you're left with this vegetable that looks a little bit like celery, and it actually tastes a little bit more kind of celery-like, but it doesn't have as much stringiness as celery, so I prefer it to celery once I get used to the stronger carrot-like flavor. So that's well peeled. You can see that it's nice and tender. And then I could just munch away, and this is one of the most relished of the shoot vegetables found here in the Northwest Coast region. So I guess to clarify, you want to make sure it is a stem that will eventually flower, but that the flower has not yet opened up. So this one is pretty good, and I can't get enough of this. They're so good. Just eat them all the way down to the flower. And here I am talking with my mouth full. So now I'm at the top of a rocky headland overlooking the water. See Bowman Bay behind me. And this is a tree that we didn't see at Cornwall Park, but it's a broadleaf tree called Madrona, or Arbutus menziesii. Folks in Canada often call it just Arbutus for short. And it has really thin, peeling bark. One of the stories in Earth's Blanket talks about how this tree saved the Saanich from the Great Flood. They tied their canoes to it, and for that reason they no longer cut the tree for firewood, even though it has really hard, dense wood that would be really good for burning. They pay respect to this tree and don't cut it down for firewood because it saved them from the Great Flood. But anyway, these rocky bluffs allow enough sunlight to filter in sideways that short trees like this can still thrive, even though they're never going to compete well with Douglas fir for growing tall and gaining access to the sunlight. So there are Douglas fir trees around me, and you know, they're not taller yet, but they probably will get taller eventually. But the madronas, they grow out and reach for the sun sideways instead of trying to win the race for growing up and tall. So that's Pacific Madrona. Sound tall. These rocky headlands are sometimes called balds because they don't have a lot of trees, so they look bald from a distance. This one actually has a few trees, but again, there's enough light coming in from the shoreline to allow some undergrowth. And ferns are going to be covered in this unit, and this is a first fern that I want you to learn. And it's called licorice fern, and I'll show you why in a second. But isn't this odd? It looks like the fronds are starting to die back. Yet it's spring and everything else is just starting to get really green and grow at its fastest. Well, this plant actually has kind of a reverse life history. So because it grows on these really thin soils, sites that hardly have any, or just rock with a very thin layer of soil, they don't hold water very well during the summer. And this plant avoids that droughty season by dying back and going dormant in the summer. And it grows green and lush during the fall, winter, and spring when there's ample moisture. And furthermore, sometimes it's growing underneath plants like big leaf maple, or even on the trunks of big leaf maple, which have a lot of leaves that create shade during the summer. So, but those trees lose their leaves during the winter, and even though there's generally less light in the winter, when you're an understory plant like this, it's actually possible to get a little bit more light during the winter because the trees above you are losing their leaves. Okay, so now I want to show you, I'll try and actually, we'll take a pause here and I'll show you in a second the rhizome of the licorice fern. So I went off the trail a bit out of respect for the trail users, not to create a scar right next to the trail, and just gently looked under the moss and pulled up one of these rhizomes. So this is the rhizome of the licorice fern, and it is a really great tea plant. You can dry out the rhizome and break it up into small pieces and steep it in water, and it produces a very sweet tea. It has the same kind of sweetness as like stevia, and I like to mix licorice fern with grand fir needles and trailing blackberry leaves to make one of my favorite Northwest coast herbal blends. And that's I think one of the best uses of the licorice fern rhizome. Another fern is one called bracken fern, and here it is beside me. These ferns can actually get to be 6 feet tall. I'm squatting now, so even though it looks like it's as tall as me, it's not at the moment, but later in the year it may get to be that tall. A bracken fern is one that has a highly pinnately divided leaf. So this is once, twice, thricely pinnately compound. And it has a few great ethnobotanical uses. So the rhizome is about that fat and gets to be several feet long and snakes along underneath the ground and is edible. And traditionally the Nooksack really praised it highly. And actually the name Nooksack means in their language always bracken fern rhizome. And because there was a location where they always harvested the bracken fern rhizome, and so they ended up being called that as a people. So very important to them as a food. It also has some material uses. So this is a dead frond, and they are pretty soft and absorbent, and you could use them kind of like a sponge to wipe down a table. And dead fronds are laid out on boards, and you could put a salmon, say, on top of it and clean the salmon, and it'll absorb all the slime. You could also line a cooking pit, something that I'll show you later, with bracken fern fronds or sword fern fronds. So ferns are great as a material just because they're really fluffy, and when you're cooking food underground, that fluffiness is a good character because it helps insulate the food and keep it warm, and also keeps the food from touching the glowing hot rocks. And we'll see more about that in a couple weeks when I show you how a pit cook is done. So anyway, this is the bracken fern. So we've come down from the headland. The trail went up above over that little headland there. But you can see down on the beach level how steep that beach type is, or shoreline type is, and not a great place for many trees, but the trees that are there really lean out towards the ocean for sunlight. And this is something that's often called a feeder bluff, because material breaks off of that bluff and comes down onto the beach, and then that sediment is important habitat for all sorts of intertidal organisms. So here we have a different type of beach, and this is a sandy beach, and you'll notice that the sand is sort of trapped between this headland and another headland over here, and that's pretty common in the protected waters of the Puget Sound. We just don't have a ton of heavy surf that's going to create sands, and so usually the sands just are found in deeper bays where they're trapped and they can't move. And so there's this process called longshore drift, and essentially wave action going up and down the beach is always moving sediments in a particular direction, and the finer they are, the farther they can go until they get stuck somewhere. So this is where they got stuck. Another cool feature about this particular place is that over there, that used to be an island, but all these sediments over time accumulated between that little island and the island that we just came off of, Fidalgo Island, and until they piled up high enough to create an area that was above the high tide line. And so this is a geological feature called a tombolo, essentially a narrow peninsula that's created by the process of longshore drift that I just described. So anyway, sandy backshores are different than the gravelly backshore that we just saw and the rocky backshore that we just saw. So we're going to take a look at this really sandy backshore. It's also very low, and so there are some water features on the other side that are a little bit salty because they're influenced by the highest of the high tides. This is a plant called miner's lettuce, and it is called that because the miners used to eat it like lettuce. Really edible and delicious, actually my favorite wild green. Now, oddly, here in the Northwest Coast cultural area, there weren't a lot of leafy greens that are traditionally eaten, and but today some different indigenous peoples eat miner's lettuce. But if you look into the historical literature, there's not a lot of ethnographic records for it. Now, miner's lettuce has a cool leaf type. I mentioned in class it's the perfoliate leaf, and so the stem of the leaf actually perforates, the flowering stem actually perforates the leaf. So that's a good identification feature. It has a thick fleshiness that is similar to like spinach, and it really likes growing in sunny places. I actually don't usually see it in backshores like this, but more so on in this region, at least, on sandstone cliffs. So I'm just gonna stay here for the next few hours and munch on miner's lettuce because, man, it is just so delicious. Yarrow loves growing close to the shorelines, and here's a nice clump of yarrow. You could recognize it by the fern-like leaves, highly divided. The scientific name is Achillea millifolia because it has apparently millions of little leaflets. And the Achillea part comes from the fact that Achilles is said to have used it to cure his wounds. It works as a staunch. If you crush up the leaves, you could put it on a wound and it'll stop the bleeding. And it makes a nice tea. It's very fragrant, aromatic. Yarrow. Excellent plant. Oh, here's a plant that I always see right in the high tide, or just above the high tide line. This is called Oric, or Atriplex, and it has these leaves that look like little shovel heads. And it's salty and delicious. Atriplex. So the backshore of this sandy beach is mounded up by waves that push sand under this mound, and then it actually slopes down again. And we see there's a wetland behind the beach here, And there's standing water there, too deep for wetland plants. There is what's called the emergent zone of a marsh here. So we have a lot of reed-like plants. They're actually called bulrushes. And then over here where the water doesn't reach, this is a little bit higher. This is called the high marsh, and we have more herbaceous plants in the high marsh. So just to reiterate, there's so much habitat diversity packed into this beach because of all the different geological forces going on, you know, waves moving sediment, bedrock sticking out in places, places that are impacted by salt water, places that aren't, sea spray, wind, all these different abiotic forces are really shaping this environment. And that's a theme I want you to think about when thinking about habitat diversity, because a lot of diversity is shaped by abiotic forces like climate and disturbance. The low marsh is dominated by emergent plants like this bulrush, and they have a cool adaptation that I like to call the plant snorkel that enables them to survive in areas that are often inundated by water. And this provides stress to plants because underwater there's not a lot of gas and plants need to breathe, just like humans, although it's a little different. But anyway, they can, bulrushes can actually transport gases, carbon dioxide and such, from above the water line down to below the water line, and they have really spongy tissue on the inside called parenchymus tissue that enables the gas to move down the plant underwater to the roots to do that gas exchange. Indigenous peoples take advantage of the sponginess of these bulrushes and use them for weaving. This is one of the highest or most prized items for making mats. You could think of it a bit like nature's thermarest. So bulrushes and cattails, another plant, I don't see any here, but maybe we'll see it at some other place, both have a lot of that parenchymus tissue or that spongy tissue and are both used for mat making. Oh, and another use, the white bases of these bulrushes are edible. Also true for cattail. The highest regions of this area that's occasionally inundated by salt water, called a salt marsh, it's often dominated by a plant called silverweed. And silverweed has a pinnately compound leaf. It's called silverweed because the undersides are really silvery. And if we look down under the plant, we'll find the part that has the most ethnobotanical significance. So there are roots connected to the silverweed which are edible, and they're actually best harvested in the fall. Right now, if I were to eat them, they'd be very bitter. So I'm just gonna put this right back. Also in the littoral zone between the driftwood and woody plants, it's common to find this plant here called beach pea, especially on more surf-swept beaches with sand and gravel. Now, beach pea has a flower that looks very much like a garden pea. If you're a gardener, you'll recognize this. And remember that peas are in a family, or I guess I'll tell you that peas are in a family that have flowers that only have bilateral symmetry instead of radial symmetry. And they tend to have leaves that are pinnately compound, and they often have these little tendrils that climb on things and provide some support. That's a way that they can get access to the sun without having to invest in woody plant tissue. Anyway, the beach pea produces a pea, and it's one of the few grain-like things that are traditionally eaten along the coast here. So there's good references to the nit-nat on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and only a few others actually. I think the macaw that eat the beach peas. So you have to get them, you have to harvest them when they're still green inside, and they taste a lot like garden peas. Now we're up above the influence of any seawater, but there probably isn't enough moisture here for trees, and so this is a good place for shrubs. And this is a great shrub called coastal black gooseberry, and it has vicious looking thorns that are up to an inch long but it produces a black gooseberry that's edible, and I think one of our best of the currants and gooseberries. I'm in another salt marsh here, just on the other side of that sandy beach, and salt marshes are often associated with river features, and the river will contribute a lot of fresh water, and so the plants in what are called estuarine salt marshes generally don't have to be so adapted to salt. They just have to be able to tolerate maybe half the salt water of the ocean water because it gets mixed with fresh water from the river. But this particular salt marsh basically is getting full strength seawater. There's no river nearby. And so the only plants that are found here are those that are the most tolerant of seawater. And there's two, one called pickleweed and the other called seaside plantain, and they're both pretty edible. Seaside plantain is actually one of my favorites here. It's thick, hardy green. You could just munch on it fresh, and it's one of the few leafy greens that has a rich history of being eaten up and down the coast. Pickleweed being the other, and I think it's curious that both of them resemble more shoot vegetables than leafy green vegetables in their texture. Seaside plantain is related to the plantain that might grow in your yard, the common plantain. And if you take a close look at the inflorescence, we see that it's a spike. And even though the leaves are linear and look pretty different than the common plantain in your yard, these flower spikes look very similar to common plantain. So this seaside plantain is one of the few plants that I could literally eat by the handful. It's so delicious, and usually in slightly shadier environments you might find sword fern. So beside me here is sword fern. Now sword fern, I think superficially looks a little bit like the licorice fern that I already taught you, but instead of coming out of the rhizome individually along a line, which is how the licorice fern does it, the sword fern all comes out of one clump. So this is all one sword fern plant here. And you could also compare the leaves, or the fronds as they're called. On the licorice fern, you could see that each of these leaflet type structures is connected along the entire length, whereas on sword fern they are just connected at one little point. One point. So that's a good way to tell the licorice fern from the sword fern. So I'm out near the point at Bowman Bay. I think it's called Lighthouse Point, and this is a classic bald environment, called bald again because it's generally too dry for trees to thrive. You can see behind me the duck fir made a go at it, but then there were probably a few dry summers in a row that killed it. So great environment for herbaceous plants, and because a lot of these herbaceous plants are sort of small, we'll zoom in on each one. There's a bee foraging on this beautiful delphinium, a honeybee. Yeah, so we'll go on a little tour of some of the beautiful wildflowers that we have here on this bald, and some of them have really nice ethnobotanical uses as well. Here we have nodding onion, called nodding onion because the head of the flower head nods down. And just like garden onions, the nodding onion has a bulb that has an onion-like flavor and is, often cooked with salmon and meat as a flavoring, and also just enjoyed as a vegetable. Beside me here is delphinium, and this plant is in the buttercup family. You can see that the leaves look a little bit like buttercup leaves, and it has a flower that only has one line of symmetry, so it's a irregular shape. Very beautiful, but it's a poisonous plant. And if you're interested in medicinal plants, a lot of our moist poisonous plants are also the most highly valued for plant medicines. And I don't know for sure if this is used medicinally, but if you're going to do your ethnobotany project on something related to plant medicines, this would be a good one to look into. Delphinium menziesii. Very common on these coastal bluffs, and it is in peak bloom right now. Beside me here is a plant called chocolate lily, and it doesn't taste like chocolate, but it is edible. The root underground has a very starchy character, and well, we're not going to harvest this here in the park, but a good feature for identifying at this time of the year is the way the seeds flare and from a central point that kind of radiate out in these wing-like structures. And this particular one, you could see the flower bits here are done. They're withering away as the seed swells. So chocolate lilies need a lot of sunlight, and I almost always find them growing on coastal bluffs. We actually have two different types of onions. You can see on the left here is the nodding onion with that classic nodding character, and then next to it is one called taper tip onion. And notice how the tip of it is tapered. How convenient. So those are our two most common types of onions, but in Washington we actually have, I don't know, close to a dozen species of onions. Rich place to be for onion hunting. I'm excited to find one of my favorite plants in one of my favorite places out here on Village Point at Deception Pass. Plant beside me here is common camas, and common camas is probably the most valuable root vegetable in the Salish Sea region, and grows especially well in the islands where there's a drier habitat which keeps the trees at bay. We actually have two different types of camas in Western Washington, giant camas and common camas. And this is common camas, and a good way to tell them apart is when you look at the flower. It has 6 tepals. Tepals are basically just a word when you can't distinguish the sepals from the petals, you call them tepals. And with common camas, you could see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are all in the upper half of the circle of petals, whereas one sticks straight down, and it's the only one in the lower half. Giant camas, on the other hand, all the petals radiate kind of equally around the circle. And another good feature is that the petals of the common camas, they kind of wither in a haphazard way, whereas the petals of giant camas twist together tightly before they fall off. So here is the common camas, which is more common on shallow soil sites, whereas the giant camas is usually found on deeper soil sites, but there's definitely some overlap in their habitat preference. The valuable part of the camas is a bulb that looks sort of like an onion bulb, made up of fleshy scales, and it needs to be cooked for a really long time in order to be edible. It has a type of carbohydrate called inulin that needs to caramelize before it is digestible. So in order to caramelize the camas bulb, you need to cook it for anywhere from 36 to 48 hours, and it'll actually change from a very bright white to almost a black color when it's fully cooked. Just like when you're caramelizing onions in a skillet, they change from a white color to a dark brown. So the best season for harvesting camas is right around now, when they're blooming, and you could easily distinguish them from death camas, which has white flowers, which you wouldn't want to eat because it's poisonous. Here's the death camas, the one that we don't want to confuse with common camas, and just some features to distinguish it from the common camas. We can see that the flowers are white, and that they're very compact right at the top of the flower spike. Other than that, most of the features are pretty darn similar to the death camas, but it is very poisonous. I think just 1 or 2 bulbs and you would be in real rough shape. All the yellow plants around me are a beautiful plant called spring gold. and below the spring gold plant is a long taproot that is edible as well. It's not used so much anymore today, but used to be another important traditional food. How interesting that these coastal bluffs and bald habitats are so rich in traditional root vegetables. I'll leave you with fern. This is the lady fern, and it is a fern that grows in a clump like the sword fern did, so all the fronds come down to one base. And a good feature for distinguishing the lady fern from the similar wood fern is that it has kind of a football shape, so the widest part is in the middle of the frond. Whereas if this were a wood fern, it would essentially look like this, where the widest, the bottom of the branches would be the longest, instead of the middle of the branches being the longest. Here at Deception Pass, we've explored a number of different habitats, many of them shoreline habitats. We've seen everything from a sandy beach with the dune backshore, a salt marsh with plants that have special adaptations for growing out of water or dealing with saline water. We've seen bluffs and plants that have special adaptations for dealing with really dry conditions that are too dry for trees. And we talked a little bit about how many edible roots there were and how curious it was that so many of those roots are found in those dry habitats. So I want to leave you with a thought on plant adaptations that has to do with the edibleness, the edibility of several different root species and how they tend to be fairly large. And essentially those are storage tissues for the plant. So they're storing calories throughout a period of hardship. Now, in many parts of the world, the period of hardship is the winter, but here in Western Washington, our winters are fairly mild. And rather, in that bluff habitat, the period of hardship is actually the intensely dry summers. So the plants go dormant, die back to that underground root, and wait out the dry summer. And it just so happens that they feel like those plants feel like they're free of predation because they're underground, but humans with our digging tools, we can dig down in to the ground and unearth those storage tissues and eat them for our own benefit. Now, fortunately, a number of those plants have pretty good adaptations for dealing with the occasional disturbance of the soil. Many of them can divide asexually and turn into multiple roots, or the seeds actually require some disturbed soil to germinate better. So we'll reflect more on this in our unit on management and plant tending, but just know that plants might be in danger of being over-harvested in some cases, but many of the plants of ethnobotanical significance actually have very sophisticated adaptations to deal with some harvesting by humans and animals. So that's all for this unit, coastal herb and fern identification and ethnobotany, as well as a look at the different number of habitats found along the coastal fringe. So thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll tune in next time.